Hi, everybody. This is our first lecture video of the semester, and it is an overview of what history is as a field. It is possible that some of you may have had me before for another history course. Even if you've had me before, I encourage you to watch this video again. At the very least, jump ahead to the end of it if you've had me before, because I talk about things specific to this course, the modern world. So, history is the study of the past. And because of that, it is inherently chronological. We are interested in when things happened and in the order things happened in. What came before something else and what came at about the same time as something else. But history is not just a list of dates. And for the most part, what you'll see in this course is that I am not particularly interested in specific dates. And your textbook really isn't either, I don't think. It certainly talks about them, and there are certain important dates in world history. Um, it's usually enough to know the year, and even then, it's not a big focus as maybe it was in some history courses that you might have taken in high school or somewhere else. Um, Even then, it probably wasn't a huge focus. A date-based focus tends to be viewed as a little bit old-fashioned, maybe ironically, by historians. The nature of history is something that historians do disagree about, and I'm going to give you my perspective, which is just one of many out there. History's purpose is to uncover the past, and this is harder than it seems. We can never be 100% certain of what happened in the past unless we invent a time machine, and we'll talk about why that is a little bit. Um, and so history is interested in considering how people acted in the past, what happened. Um, Increasingly, historians are interested in common people, not just rulers or generals or admirals and things like that. Um, and that is hard because of the sources that we have available to us. History is about probability. Historians look for things that are likely to have occurred. Things that have a high probability that we think this happened. We think maybe this is why it happened or this were the effects of it. And so, again, we can never be 100% certain. Now, about many things, we are 99.9999999% certain, right? But if we're looking at individual facts, but if we're looking at anything broader than that, we're always looking at probability, what likely happened, what the likely reasons were. And that comes from this that I'm going to come back to, but I want to skip ahead to it. Why can't we be 100% sure? Because eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable. There have been studies done in colleges often where a student is sort of warned ahead of time and said, hey, someone is going to come into the class, they're going to run in, they're going to take your backpack or something off your desk or table, and they're going to run out. Don't worry, you'll get it back. Like we're going to do an experiment. And it happens, and then the people in the class are asked, hey, please write down what, oh my gosh, what just happened? Someone stole this person's, purse or their backpack or something else, please write down what you saw so that we can have accounts. And the accounts do not mesh. They don't relate to each other. Similarly, researchers have interviewed people after sort of tragedies that have affected sort of the national consciousness. And so, I don't know if this is something that I don't know if there's something like that recently has occurred. Um, when I was a child, the two things that I remember occurring were in the early 1980s, President Ronald Reagan, there was an assassination attempt. And I remember where I was when I heard about that attempt, even though I was only probably 7 or 8 at the time. Um, and then similarly, a few years later, the space shuttle Challenger exploded. And again, I remember where I was. Some of you who are a little bit older than a traditional age student might remember where you were when you heard about the September 11th attacks, for example. Um, And so what researchers do is they interview people sort of like the day after, and they're like, "Hey, where were you when the September 11th attacks happened? How did you first find out about them?" And they will tell them, "Oh, I was, I'll tell you, well, like for me, I was teaching seventh grade language arts in Wichita. I was in my portable, and a college student worker intern came to my door and said, just so you know, this is what happened. Like, we didn't have TVs in our classrooms or anything like that. We had no idea what was going on." Um, and so they like the next day they come and they interview people, or soon after, and then they do a longitudinal study, a study that takes time, and so they might come back a year later, or 5 years later, or 10 years later, and they ask them again. Tell me again where you were when September 11th happened. Tell me again what you remember when Reagan was shot, or when the space shuttle exploded, or something else. And the people's stories change because human memory is unreliable. So this is a very long-winded of saying a thing of saying that while eyewitness accounts have their place, and sometimes that's often all we have, we can't trust them 100%. And that's why I say history is about probability. So if one person's eyewitness account says something, that is maybe not trustworthy. But if 100 people's eyewitness accounts say something, that might be more trustworthy. Even then, though, there are perhaps historical examples of things like sort of mass hallucinations or mass psychoses that have occurred, maybe for various reasons, and so even that can sometimes be tricky. So all of that to say is that history is uncertain. That's why for a book like your textbook, which is now in its second edition. But the main book that this comes from has gone through, like, I don't know, a dozen editions or so. The reason that history textbooks change isn't just because textbook publishers are greedy and want people to keep buying new books. That is part of it, don't get me wrong. But it's because we uncover new evidence as historians, and we have new theories about what happened in the past, as well as new ideas of what's important to cover. Right? This book covers from about 1400 to the present, and it is around, not including the index and the preface, it is around 1400 pages. That's a lot. I'm aware of that. And this is actually the short version of the book. Like, I had you buy the short version of volume 2. The full book, this isn't it. This is a different one, but like the full book is even bigger. Um, and it's longer, and it covers obviously more information. Um, so anyway, part of the reason that books change is because we have a limited amount of space to talk about the world. And the author of your book is unique in that it has a single author, which is really unusual for a world history textbook, has had to make choices about what parts of the world to talk about, when, and where. Because we can't give a a 500 to 600 year history of all of the regions of the world in a book of this length. And they haven't done that. And a world history book typically doesn't. One thing to be aware of as we go through the course is the idea of presentism, and we want to avoid that, in my opinion. And I want you to avoid it. So since I'm teaching the course, we are going to avoid presentism. And presentism is looking at and evaluating the past through the lens of the present. In other words, it is judging what happened in 1650 by the standards of 2026. You might have heard of ethnocentrism in a class. Ethnocentrism is when somebody judges other cultures by the standards of their own culture. And we usually don't like ethnocentrism. We think that cultures should be judged by their own standards, or at least not judged by ours necessarily. This is like that, except it's based on time instead of culture. Historians usually dislike presentism. There are some fairly liberal historians who have recently argued that that's actually fine. It's okay to do that. I don't want to get into those arguments for our purposes here in this course, and I'm going to say that I think we should try to avoid them. We should try to avoid presentism. Similarly, objectivity is also something that most historians think that we should strive for, but that also recognize that it is probably impossible because our individual cultures and our beliefs, our worldviews, our perspectives, they color how we view the world. They determine what we think is important or not, what questions we even ask about the past, what we notice about the past. All of that is based on our cultures and beliefs. And although it's important for us to think about our cultures and beliefs to try to be aware of the biases that we might have, it's impossible to completely overcome those because sometimes we don't even think of questions to ask because it's just so outside of our backgrounds. But it should still be our aim to be as objective as possible. And that I mentioned bias. Bias isn't necessarily a bad thing. You can be biased for or against something. Obvious, it's bad when you are biased against people of certain backgrounds or races or cultures and things like that. Um, but you might be biased against people who are, mass murderers. That would probably be something good to be biased about in most cases. You can also be biased in favor of something. I am biased in favor of education. I am biased in favor of history. I think history is an important subject. Whatever your biases are, it's important to try to recognize what they are and also what those of others are. All writers have biases. The writer of your textbook has biases. Um, the multiple writers of other textbooks all have their own biases. That's okay, but it's important to try to recognize what they are. One word that you might run across is historiography. We aren't going to go into this a whole bunch. It simply means the study of historical writing. So it's studying not the actual topic, but how people have written about it. So, for example, in this course, we will probably talk briefly about the French Revolution. And a historiographical approach would look at how historians or people in general wrote about the French Revolution in the early 1800s, right after it had happened, or even as it was happening, and how others wrote about it in the 1850s, and how others wrote about it in the early 20th century, and in the middle 20th century, and the late 20th century, and how they've written about it has changed over time. That's true for the American Revolution. It is true for issues of the Industrial Revolution. It's true for globalization. It's true for everything, essentially, that this changes over time. It's another reason why textbooks change. Historiography changes as well. Historians usually use primary and secondary sources. The most valuable sources typically for historians to use are primary sources, and this is evidence from the time actually being studied. So it's letters, maybe government records, newspapers if they exist. They often do in the period we're working with. Diaries or journals, pictures or drawings, and artifacts are also examples of primary sources. Secondary sources are sources that are once removed from a primary source. They aren't primary sources themselves, but they are how people have interpreted primary sources. So, an article in a journal like the American Historical Review or Speculum, which is a journal for world history, um, these are secondary sources. They are based on primary sources usually, and they are interpretations of. A tertiary source is a source that is several times removed from a primary source. Textbooks are tertiary sources. Reference materials like encyclopedias are tertiary sources. You usually want to avoid tertiary sources um, for any important writing, but they are useful for getting an overview of things. They are in world history, because it's so broad, we are more likely to use secondary and even sometimes tertiary sources than primary sources. But in general, history gives primacy to primary sources. Primary sources are those that are most valued by most historians, but primary sources are also biased. We can think about that if we're looking in American history and we're looking at a mid 19th century primary sources, a primary source that is written by in a free black person who has never been a slave, compared to a primary source written by a black person who escaped slavery, compared to a primary source of a black person who was enslaved at the time, compared to a primary source of a white abolitionist, compared to the primary source of a white slave owner, compared to a primary source of maybe an average white person in the North that wasn't particularly concerned about slavery, you're going to get very different accounts and opinions about slavery. Every author has their own biases. So we need to consider that. We also need to consider who the author is writing for. Are they writing for just themselves, or are they writing for public consumption? To understand a primary source, we need to understand the era. So if we're talking about primary sources in 16th century sub-Saharan Africa, we need to understand what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa in the 16th century. So there are different primary sources. Written sources are the ones that historians typically prefer. Archaeology can give us insight as well. And oral traditions, particularly for people who um, have not had literacy traditionally or have had very limited literacy, are also potentially important sources. They also need to be used cautiously. So written sources require literacy, and throughout much of history, only social elites were often literate. And this was often a very small subset of the overall population. Now, that does vary. There were past societies that had a relatively high rate of literacy, um, but that was rare, and even those relatively high rates were often low compared to what we might consider literacy or a literate society today. For archaeological sources, the issue there is that tends to be hard to see all elements of culture. Like sometimes we might see, for example, examples of past pottery, which can be interesting. It might give us some insights, but it's hard to tell from pottery all sorts of cultural elements from that. And dating archaeological sources is also really challenging. Again, historians interpret the past differently. Different sources lead to different interpretations of the past. Things like cause and effect are hotly debated by historians, and good, quality, well meaning, well trained, honest historians can come to different conclusions even when they do everything right because different primary sources can give us different interpretations. That can be true even when it's a primary source written by the same person because people's views change over time. Our point in this class is to have conversations about probabilities in world history or global history, including what is more or less likely to have happened, what is more or less likely to have been a cause. And throughout, it's okay to disagree. Historians disagree with each other. But we need to back up our disagreements with evidence, evidence that is reliable. It's important to be respectful with people that we disagree with, and to always presume that the person we're disagreeing with has positive intentions. They are not deliberately trying to provoke us. They're not deliberately trying to misinform us. So now a few things about this course and about world history sort of in general. The first thing I want to mention is how years are dated. There's traditional and contemporary dating norms. We, of course, are dealing with the modern era, which is after 14 or 1500. So traditionally, those would be years that would be indicated with AD. AD stands for the Latin phrase Anno Domini. It means in the year of our Lord. And AD always goes before the year. So this would be AD 2026, not 2026 AD. In a recognition that students and scholars and historians are not all Christian, over the past several decades, there's been a movement towards a different dating nomenclature where instead of BC for before Christ, we have BCE for before the Common Era or the Christian Era. And then instead of AD for in the year of our Lord, we have CE, which stands for the Common Era or the Christian Era, depending on who you ask. All of those go after the year. So while this year would be AD 2026, it is 2026 CE. Because because all of our work is essentially going to be after 1500, when it's all in that same era, we just assume that we're talking about AD or CE, and we aren't going to put that in the years. But I do want to point that out because you might see either of these dating formats used as you encounter things in this course. So why study history? There's lots of reasons. Your textbook talks about some of them in the preface as well. I think one reason is it's important to understand history to understand cultures. That includes our own culture. Whatever your own individual cultural identity might be, part of that is historical, and understanding history helps you understand that. It's also important to help us understand global cultures, and it helps us to reveal similarities and differences in what it means to be human, in the human experience that has similarities across time and space and also has differences across time and space. And sometimes historians and others overemphasize similarities, and sometimes they overemphasize differences. And both those things are mistakes. People are very different in many ways, and people are very similar in many ways. We need to recognize both those things. Historical standards that are often taught in the K-12 world and sometimes in college also talk about the idea of continuity and change. The idea that over time we have themes of history that have tended to be continuous. They have tended to, we can stretch them back for centuries or even millennia, but we also have change over time. So history is a study of both of those things as well. You may have heard a quote attributed to Santayana, that those something to the lines of those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it. Most historians don't like that quote because Santayana was not a historian, and because that's not necessarily true. Knowledge of history doesn't mean that the same thing isn't going to happen again. But beyond that, um, most Western historians believe that history is largely linear, and that although certainly some similar things happen, right? Continuity and change, continuity, similarities, that's not the same as history being truly cyclical. Now, in other cultures, the idea of history as a cycle is widespread. Now, I want to mention world history because, again, depending on where you went to high school and when you went to high school, if you took a world history course, it may have been mostly a European history course. That is not true for this course, and it's not true in general for college world history courses. As I mentioned earlier, it's impossible to cover all of the history of the world. We have to pick and choose. And so, what historians of world history usually do is, rather than going strictly chronologically, like an American history course often does, or a European history course often does, or a history course related to Asian history, or African history, or Latin American history often does, in world history, you often look for themes that broadly connect. That's what your author has done. Your author views the world history as a series of webs. And in this, he is using the work of his dad. Your author's name is J.R. McNeill. His dad's name was William, and William was a well regarded, very influential world historian. I don't know if say it's true to say he came up with the idea, but he at the very least popularized this idea of world history as interrelated webs. Um, his writing was very, let's say, it was very dense. It was not an easy read. I had to read it in graduate school. Um, J.R. McNeill's writing is much easier to read. And I chose this book for a bunch of reasons, including the fact that I think it's well written. So, your author, as he goes through world history, um, will look at broad themes that connect. So, for example, Chapter 17 is Cultural Upheavals, Religious and Intellectual Movements 1500 to 1750. And so that includes in Europe the Renaissance and the Reformations. That includes also the Reformation movements in the Islamic world. It includes the birth of the Sikh religion in India. It includes both the coming of Christianity to some East Asian nations like China and Japan, and also Confucian reforms in China. So there's a theme there in chapter 17. From a pretty broad time period. Notice it doesn't talk about what's going on in Africa really at that time. It doesn't talk about what's going on in Latin America at that time. That's what world historians have to do. They have to pick and choose. So the next chapter is chapter 18. I'm just looking randomly here in the book, which is Empires and Power, and it's looking at general warfare, but then specifically power in Japan and the Tokugawa consolidation, the Qing consolidation in China, the Mughal Empire in India, the growth of the Ottoman Empire in Southwest Asia and Southeast Europe, the growth of the Russian Empire, the growth of the Habsburg Empire in Europe, and then the rise of Europe as a global power. So lots of different information um, joined together under common themes over pretty broad time spans. And so I do want to just point out that sometimes when people hear the name the modern world, they think of that this is a history of, the 20th and 21st centuries, and that's not accurate. I mentioned that historians disagree. This is one of the things they disagree about is how to divide up history into eras. Um, this is what I sort of came up with after doing some recent research today as I was revising this presentation. This is more from a Western perspective, because not all societies across the world would have these same eras, although many have a lot of similarities. And so, in general, the prehistoric era is something that historians have recently started to get more interested in, but traditionally have not been. This is the era before the invention of writing. So that's around 3000 BCE. The ancient era, which is sometimes called the classical era, especially when talking about Europe, is from the invention of writing to around the year 500. And all of these are around. Like these are all circa, which means around or about. Historians, they say, disagree about these a lot. Um, that classical time is followed by the medieval period, particularly in Europe. In Europe, it's often called the Middle Ages. Middle Ages is often not used in a global perspective, but there are some similarities between medieval feudalism and knights and things like that, a little bit between Europe and some other countries and some other regions at times. And the medieval period itself can be roughly divided into the high Middle Ages, which people often think of when they think of knights and stuff like that, and then the later Middle Ages. And then the modern era is, some people would say it's from 1500 to the present, and other people would say it's from 1500 to 1950, and contemporary history is since 1950, or actually since 1945 and the end of World War II. Other people argue differently, but contemporary is in in recent memory. Now, I was born in the 1970s. I don't remember 1950 or 1960. It was decades before I was born, but it's still in the contemporary memory of working historians. So this course deals with roughly the 1400s, just to set the context of the present. Within that time period is also the early modern period. That is sometimes considered 1500 to potentially the American Revolution, or potentially the French Revolution in 1776 or in the 1790s, or alternately around 1700, just after the Glorious Revolution in England, which happened in 1688. So again, our focus here is roughly from 1400 to the present. And again, historians do disagree about how these dates are structured. These are very broad categories. So I hope this helps you to maybe start thinking a little bit about history. Hopefully, one of the things I hope you'll get from this course is not just that history can be interesting, but that it is changing, it is controversial, which can be interesting, and it's important. And I hope you develop a deeper appreciation for it through the course. And if you ever have questions, please reach out. There is a sort of, do you have a question discussion board that you can post in. But if you have a question for me about something, send me an email. I'm always happy to talk. Thanks for watching.